Indian Economy article, Employment Scenario in India. More than 80% of India's unemployed workforce comprises its youth, said a report by the International Labour Organization, ILO, on March 26, 2024. The India Employment Report 2024, jointly released by the ILO and the Institute of Human Development, IHD, said that the proportion of young individuals with secondary education or higher among the total unemployed youth surged from 35 to 2% in 2000 to 65.7% in 2022. The India Employment Report 2024 is the third in the series of regular publications by the Institute for Human Development on labor and employment issues. Undertaken in partnership with the International Labour Organization, ILO, this report examines the challenge of youth employment in the context of the emerging economic, labor market, educational and skill scenarios in India and the changes witnessed over the past 2 decades. Indian labor market. ILO's report presented a trend in employment scenario during the post-independence era, particularly during the year 2000 and 2022. Although, this period does not represent the true picture of employment scenario in the country because of upheavals created by unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic which derailed the growth process to a large extent. However, the report noted the following characteristics of Indian labor market. Full circle. Indian economy did not follow the traditional growth pattern as was observed in majority of developed countries in their journey from agrarian economy to highly advanced service sector dominated economy. Growth pattern of majority of developed country during the post-agrarian era was mostly based on the development of industrial sector through Industry 1.0, Industry 2.0, Industry 3.0, followed by a mix of Industry 4.0 and Services 4.0. On the contrary, India witnessed a peculiar path moving from agricultural development to the development of services sector, keeping the industrial sector almost stagnant. During the era of liberalization, privatization and globalization, high growth of Indian economy was led by services sector. But, this pattern was not followed in employment generation. Although the share of agriculture in total employment has declined, it has largely shifted to services, which account for 23% of total employment. Agriculture accounted for a mere 14% share of GDP in 2022 while services amounted to 55% and manufacturing for 18%. Full circle. Until recently, the open unemployment rate was low, at 2 to 3%, which increased to about 5 to 8% in 2019, but further declined in 2022. The low open unemployment rate is indicative of the lack of livelihood opportunities common to developing economies. The Indian labor market is highly informal. Around 90% of workers are informally employed. Although the percentage of regular workers has increased along with the share of formal sector workers are informal. The persistence of self-employment is another feature of the Indian labor market, and self-employment continues to constitute about half of total employment in the economy, which is indeed one of the highest in the world. The labor market is highly segmented in terms of gender, location, occupation, social groups and geographical regions. Although the gap in earnings across gender and other social categories has declined over the years, the broad socio-economic hierarchies in access to employment, education and earnings persists. Women's labor force participation rate is very low, at around 25% of the total female working age population in 2022. It increased during the pandemic, driven by a significant increase in subsistence employment. India has one of the lowest female labor force participation rates in the world, which is a reflection of its considerable gender inequalities. Labor force participation. The above table gives following conclusions. The LFPR in India for individuals aged 15 years and older was 55 to 2% in 2022, which was lower than the world average of 59 to 8%. It consistently declined over the past 2 decades, from 61 to 6% in 2000 to 50 to 2% in 2019, before increasing to 55 to 2% in 2022. Table 1. The worker population ratio, WPR, exhibits a similar trend, which declined from 60 to 2% in 2000 to 47 to 3% in 2019 before increasing to 52.9% in 2022. The overall open unemployment rate, measured by the usual status criteria, was quite low at 2 to 3% in 2002 to 1% in 2012. However, sharply increased to 5 to 8% in 2019, followed by a significant fall to 4 to 1% in 2022. Full circle. The substantial increase in the open unemployment rate between 2012 and 2019 was primarily due to the growth of the labor force without a corresponding increase in employment. But the increase in the labor force from 2019 to 2022 was accompanied by significant growth in the workforce and a decrease in unemployment. Table 2. Gender divide. The gender divide in labor force participation is visible in the above table, which shows that the female LFPR declined sharply by 14 to 4 percentage points when compared with the male counterparts by 8 to 1 percentage points between 2000 and 2019. But this trend reversed between 2019 and 2022 with a much greater increase in the female LFPR. There is a considerable gender gap in the Indian labor market, with the women's LFPR 32 to 8% in 2022, around 2 to 3 times lower than the rate for men at 77 to 2%. India's low LFPR is largely attributed to the low female LFPR, which is much lower than the world average for 2022 of 47 to 3%, but higher than the South Asian average of 24 to 8%. LFPR in rural areas came down to 57.4% in 2022 from 65 to 6% in 2000. It shows a percentage point decline of 8 to 2. In contrast to it, percentage point decline in LFPR in urban areas during the same period was only 51 to 0% in 2000 to 49.6% in 2022. Underemployment. Time-related underemployment in India was high as of 2022, at 7.5%. It had fluctuated over the years, increasing from 8 to 1% in 2012 to 9.1% in 2019 before declining to that 7 to 5% in 2022. The underemployment rate was only slightly higher among men in 2022, at 7.7%, than among women, at 7.1%, and more prevalent in urban areas, at 8 to 4%, than in rural areas, at 7 to 2%. Although underemployment was considerably higher than open unemployment, it, too, came down between 2019 and 2022, especially among women, by 2.5 percentage points. Again, the increase in underemployment in the pre-pandemic period and the decline in underemployment during the pandemic and post-pandemic periods, especially among women, raise questions about the availability of additional employment opportunities. ILO report observed. Status of employment. Full circle. The dominant category of employment in India remains self-employment, followed almost equally by regular and casual employment. In 2022, self-employment accounted for 55 to 8% of employment, while casual and regular employment accounted for 22 to 7% and 21 to 5%, respectively. Women were engaged more in self-employment, especially in rural areas, while men were more prominent in regular employment, particularly in urban areas. In 2022, the proportion of women in self-employment, at 62%, was significantly larger than that of men, at 53.1%. The opposite was true in the case of regular employment, with the proportion of men, 23 to 6%, much larger than that of women, at 16:6%. The reversal in the trend towards declining self-employment was much more significant among women than among men. Between 2000 and 2019, the share of women in self-employment declined from 55 to 4% to 53 to 2%, while the share of men remained stable, at around 51%. This trend reversed in 2022, with the proportion of women in self-employment increasing by 8 to 8 percentage points, to 62%. The percentage of men also increased, but only by about 2 percentage points, to 53.1%. The percentage of women in regular employment increased almost threefold, from 7.4% in 2000 to 21.9% in 2019, while the percentage of men increased from 17 to 3% to 24 to 4%. This trend reversed in the pandemic years, with the share of women in regular employment declining by 6 percentage points, to 16.6% in 2022, and the share of men declining marginally, by 0 to 6 percentage points, to 23 to 6%. Women in rural areas were predominantly engaged in unpaid family work of the self-employment category, which is considered the most vulnerable category of self-employment. Full circle, there was growth in the share of the formal sector between 2000 and 2019. Around 11% of all workers engaged in the organized sector in 2000. This increased to almost 20% in 2019, but the share declined to 18 to 9% in 2022. The share of formal employment in the economy also increased, although to much less extent. This indicates that a large part of the increasing number of workers in the organized sector were informal workers. The share of informal employment in total employment increased from 8 to 5% in 2000 to 105% in 2019, but declined to 9.7% in 2022 because a large share of the additional workforce was part of the informal economy. The share of regular formal employment, which is considered of better quality, during 2000 to 19 in total employment increased from 7.6% to 10 to 2% but dipped to 9 to 4% in 2022. Key changes have witnessed in Indian economy and labor market during post-liberalization and economic reforms era. Table 3. Full circle, employment growth remained stagnant up to 2019 and then moved upward. Full circle, employment has shifted from low productivity agriculture to relatively higher productivity non-agriculture sectors. The construction sector maintains high employment elasticity. Growth in manufacturing employment remains sluggish despite the robust gross value added growth. The service sector has been the primary driver of India's growth since 2000. There has been slow and steady structural transformation, which reversed after 2019. Youth employment challenge of the future. As per projections of the United Nations Population Fund, 68% of the population of India is in the age group of 15 to 64 years in the year 2024. India is expected to be in the potential demographic dividend zone for at least another decade. But the country is at an inflection point because the youth population, at 27% of the total population in 2021, is expected to decline to 23% by 2036. Each year, around 7-8 million youths are added to the labor force whose productive utilization could lead to India reaping a demographic dividend, ILO report said. Report also observed that the education participation of youths and youths who are out of the labor force drive the low youth labor force participation rate. Youths have greater participation than adults in regular employment and comparatively lower participation in self-employment. Among self-employed persons, the proportion of unpaid family workers is much larger for youths than for adults. Other findings of the ILO report regarding youth employment following. Our youth employment is, by and large, of poorer quality than employment for adults. The structural features of youth employment indicate less presence in the agriculture sector, although with an obvious gender gap. Educated youths have experienced much higher levels of unemployment. Nowhere youths. India has a large proportion of youths, particularly young women, not in education, employment or training. Technological change and digitalization have rapidly affected the demand for skills and for certain types of employment. Because states are at different stages of demographic transition, the potential demographic advantage also varies across them, as do the employment outcomes. A synthetic indicator constructed toward this report to capture regional outcomes found that youths fare poorly in Bihar, Jharkhand, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Assam, Odisha and West Bengal, many of which also otherwise have a high potential demographic advantage. But most of the southern and western states, along with some of the northern states, such as Himachal Pradesh and Delhi, show higher values of the composite index. Education attainment among the youth has improved significantly in the past 2 decades across all sections of youth, indicating that youth are better equipped to deal with technological change and emerging labor market opportunities. Returns to education are low at lower levels of education. Non-student youths have had a declining worker population ratio except during the recent pandemic period. The probability of any kind of employment is lower as education rises but higher for youths having technical education. A large proportion of highly educated young men and women, including the technically educated, are overqualified for the job they have. Skills and active labor market policies. The current scenario of India's labor market has following peculiar phenomenon. There is a mismatch in the demand and supply of labor. Supply of labor is in excess as compared to demand. Those who are available in the labor market lack skill as per the requirements of the job. It leads to lower employability of the job seekers. In this regard, the ILO report observes, in the rapidly changing labor market scenario, skills training is needed to improve the employability of youths, while short-term skills training along with other ALMPs are needed to bridge the supply-demand gaps and skill mismatches.